This episode is brought to you in part by the Table Podcast from the Hendricks Center at Dallas Theological Seminary. I'm Darrell Bach, one of the hosts, and I invite you to join us as we discuss issues of God and culture, which includes anything and everything. Listen on your podcast app or at dts.edu/thetable.
This episode is part of a long series exploring how some evangelicals tie themselves to the Republican Party in the United States. This one is pretty inside baseball and references a lot of stuff I covered already this season. It might help to go back to the beginning of Season 6 to the first episode, which was titled, What is Biblical?, before you listen to this one. This is Ronald Reagan's Shibboleth. In the book of Judges, chapter 12, there's a short story. Essentially, there was an invasion by the enemies of Gilead. The people of God soundly defeated the enemies. The bad guys retreated to the border where they hoped to cross back to safety, away from the war, away from danger. Their home was just over there. But the people of Gilead didn't want their enemies to escape. And they couldn't just kill everyone going over the border or else innocent people might die. So they devised a simple test to determine if someone who was crossing the border was friend or foe. They had potential enemies pronounce a word as proof of which group they were in. If the border patrol heard an accent, they'd kill the invader. No accent, they'd set him free. The word was Shibboleth. It means ear of corn or river. Today, it stands as a test to see if someone is a friend or a foe. So, a warrior steps up.
Read this word.
Shibboleth.
No accent, she lives.
Thanks for visiting Gilead. Come again.
Another person steps up.
Hi there, big fella. Read this word for me.
Shibboleth?
That was an accent. He didn't pronounce it right, so that was the end of him. A test to see who was on their side and who was against them. Okay, now fast forward a few thousand years to the election of 1980. A lot of politicians were making big claims that they represented families. They attend church. Their mama was a Christian. But some evangelical leaders wanted to hear something more specific. Their Shibboleth. In his book, Reaganland, historian Rick Perlstein recounts an interesting series of events that put presidential candidates to the test. Who is with evangelicals and who is just pretending? One of the candidates who didn't make the cut was John Connally. He was the former governor of Texas, pro-capital punishment, former Treasury Secretary to Richard Nixon. Pretty solid bona fides for a conservative at that time. In the lead up to the 1980 election, evangelical leaders asked the candidates about their faith. Oh, and by the way, by evangelical leaders, I don't mean someone all evangelicals follow, because that person doesn't exist. There is no evangelical pope. Instead, I mean someone with a lot of followers for their publications, radio show, or TV broadcast. For example, D. James Kennedy, one of the usual suspects among these guys. And he asked John Connally,
What reason would you give God for letting you into heaven?
Simple enough, right? Connally replied with this.
My mother was a Methodist. My pappy was a Methodist. My grandmother was a Methodist. And I'd just tell him I ain't any worse than any of the other people who went into heaven.
Not quite what they were looking for. Evangelicals generally don't believe salvation is based on good works, but on faith in Christ. Connally failed the test. So Bill Bright, founder of Campus Crusade for Christ, which has now been renamed Cru, took it on himself to coach him. 1980 was not the first presidential campaign where candidates strutted their piety. Jimmy Carter and Gerald Ford had done it 4 years earlier, with Ford even inviting members of Billy Graham's organization, Youth for Christ, publishers, Bible college deans, and more to the White House. Another invited guest was Wally Criswell, one of the people later responsible for the fundamentalist takeover of the Southern Baptist Convention. He railed about integration of schools, despite having signed an SBC document denouncing segregation. Oh, Wally Criswell. He also said he'd never seen a film up to 1976, until an actor named Ronald Reagan told him it was okay to. Then he said,
I'm going to start going to some movies, and I'll tell my congregation that it's not a sin to see certain types of movies.
Even before Reagan got the Republican nomination in 1980, he had a command of these evangelicals. But that didn't get him out of answering their questions about God. Reagan wasn't regularly in the pews. He was a divorced actor who slept his way around Hollywood. He was into astrology, even hosting parties where the astrology columnist for the LA Times held court. Reagan said he never made an important decision without consulting him. He was also kind of a pretty terrible dad, which is significant in a Christian culture so enchanted by fatherhood as a sign of leadership. Ronnie had some catching up to do in the Shibboleth department. On the campaign trail, he offered plenty of vague talk about wanting to see revival in the US. And for years, he'd been saying that biblical prophecies about the end of the world were on the horizon. That the fire and brimstone in Ezekiel are proof that the enemies of God's people would be destroyed by nuclear weapons. But when he was asked if he was born again, Reagan shrugged his shoulders. Didn't know what it meant. Reagan's religion was a mishmash, but his aides knew he had to learn to talk like an evangelical. The night before his appearance at the National Religious Broadcasters Convention, he got a tutoring session. So when he was asked the next morning by D. James Kennedy what he would say at the pearly gates, Reagan responded,
I wouldn't give any reason for letting me in. I'd just ask for mercy because of what Jesus Christ did for me at Calvary.
And then he quoted John 3:16. His handlers knew how to walk that line, throw the evangelicals, this sliver faction of the Republican voting bloc, a bone. Reagan was an odd choice for fundamentalist and evangelical Christians for a number of reasons. The partying, women, divorce, and extremism. The way he was easily caught in lies about even little things. Like whether or not he really saved as many lives as he claimed he had when he was a young man working as a lifeguard. But once they got that juicy shibboleth, they switched gears. Reagan crossed the border, so to speak. Now, these evangelicals with large followings had some demands. Things that had little or nothing to do with the Bible. Lower taxes, capital punishment, fighting the Soviet Union, promises that their schools and churches wouldn't lose their tax-exempt status. It was an unexpected partnership, Reagan and this minority of Christians. But he said what they wanted to hear. He delivered their shibboleths with his usual flair. Despite the astrology, the divorce, or his sexual escapades, they had their man in Ronald Reagan. Begging the question, in all honesty, how seriously did they take the vetting process? You're listening to the show that uses journalistic tools to look inside the Christian church. We press pause on the culture wars in order to explore how we got here and how we can do better. I'm Chris Staron. This is Truce. Once again this episode, we're joined by historian and author Rick Perlstein. His books, The Invisible Bridge and Reaganland, are excellent histories that cover the rise of Ronald Reagan. I used a lot of other sources too. They're listed in your show notes and on the website.
Ronald Reagan is a guy who, was absolutely fascinated with Darbyism.
What we most often call dispensationalism, a relatively new idea in Christianity. John Nelson Darby was a preacher in the 1800s who assembled a bunch of ideas that led, essentially, to the notion that not only was world history in decline, but so was the church, that God behaves differently in different time periods. I covered this in depth last season if you want more information.
He thought the Bible predicted all sorts of things about what was going to happen in the Middle East, and his, aides would hover around him and kind of pray that he wouldn't say these things in public. Although late in 1979, he goes on Jim Bakker's TV show and says, we might be the generation that sees Armageddon.
Bakker was a TV preacher. Television was a huge medium, and millions of people followed these celebrities, no matter how low rent their studios, blatantly money-hungry their pledge drives, or shaky their theology. Reagan went on PTL to court voters.
So all these forces are kind of coming together, right? Ordinary people afraid of social changes, more and more kind of politicized and conspiratorial Christian right around figures like Jerry Falwell, James Robeson,
another televangelist,
who gives a sermon on TV in which he claims, using the National Enquirer as a source, that homosexuals are not only recruiting young boys because they can't reproduce, which was the claim of Anita Bryant in her campaign against gay rights, but they were recruiting them in order to murder them in ritual fashion, right? And he gets taken off the air, and he's such a successful martyr from this action that he has a rally in Dallas at a basketball arena with 10 or 15,000 people, organized, by the way, by Mike Huckabee, who says that people were so passionate and so angry that if he had told them to, they would have, taken apart the TV station brick by brick. So all these forces are converging in 1980 around the last man standing in the Republican nomination fight, Ronald Reagan, who, completely against the advice of his closest advisors, who I found documents in which they say, well, all these Christians are getting really politicized, but we should probably either play both sides, or we probably have more votes to gain from people who are tolerant of homosexuals than people against homosexuals. He goes all in.
Ronald Reagan courts the evangelical vote by speaking about the things that they want to hear, the cultural shibboleths. I should say, Rick picks up the culture wars over homosexuality in a few of these episodes. It was a real battle, but it was far from the only one. There were also those over segregation, school busing, textbooks, taxes, Milton Friedman's monetarism, the role of women in society, theological differences, these dark views of history and the church, and on and on and on. That's why I've spent so much time on each of those subjects. As a reminder, these culture warriors were a loud minority. This was far from being every Christian, even every evangelical. Okay, so back to Rick.
In this, same kind of spring, summer 1979 inflection point, when all these things are starting to come together, you still have a lot of the top televangelists expressing reticence to throw their lot explicitly into the world of partisan politics. For example, Billy Graham, got in a lot of trouble because he was so close to Nixon and defended him all through Watergate.
There was good reason to be cautious. Graham was, even as he attended meetings for Reagan. He, as per usual, is hard to nail down. He didn't endorse the former governor in so many words, but made public visits with Reagan in the lead up to the election. Then, he spent more days with Reagan in the White House than he did even during the Nixon years. Despite Graham's perceived reticence, others were anxious to join up with the political machine. Certainly, Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority, Bill Bright, founder of Campus Crusade for Christ, organized a publishing house that argued Christians should be involved in politics. Women were mobilized through mailing lists run by Phyllis Schlafly, Lottie Beth Hobbs, and others. The New Right, powered by money from big businesses, actively courted evangelical voters to side with laissez-faire economic models, powered by money from big businesses. 1980 wasn't an accident that came out of nowhere, or one bigoted agenda triumphing over the others, but really a nexus point of disparate movements seeking a political voice. And Reagan was their candidate. President Jimmy Carter's administration was haunted by economic woes, battles over segregation academies, continued fears about the Soviet Union, stagflation, the Panama Canal, and his ne'er-do-well brother. Yet some evangelicals were still on the fence.
Rex Humbert, he still had these old-fashioned ideas that you just do not get yourself involved in worldly affairs. But they all get together. It's Billy Graham, it's Pat Robertson, Paige Patterson of the Southern Baptist Convention.
I mean, come on, you remember Paige Patterson.
Charles Stanley, a Notre Dame professor, so again, this idea of co-belligerency, an Anglican priest, an Orthodox rabbi. They're very careful to cover their bases. We're not theocrats. We're not seeking a Christian nation.
They wanted representation, a place at the table. This was a hallmark of what Francis Schaeffer called co-belligerency, working together with other faiths and denominations for shared goals. It's what Phyllis Schlafly did years earlier in her battle against the ERA. Instead of using the separatist model of keeping people sequestered away from the world, they would join forces with other religions to accomplish their goals. Though, yes, some of them would have said that they were doing this to preserve the U.S. as a Christian nation, like R.J. Rushdoony, They wouldn't say that it was to turn the country into a theocracy where bishops and popes ruled. That wasn't the goal. They just wanted their voices to be heard.
They're called to this hotel by Paul Weyrich, who has transformed the new right into the new Christian right, and implores them to join the political discussion. And very intelligently, because these guys are very shrewd strategists, they invite the nation's most prominent political columnist, Robert Novak. And he wrote in his memoir that this is when he realized Jimmy Carter was going to lose, because he saw the intensity of these people. Pat Robertson called it one of the most moving things I've ever seen. Weyrich testified that minister after minister talked about how they were for Carter in 1976 and delivered my congregation for Carter. So they're thinking like political machines. I urged them all to vote for Carter because I thought he was a moral individual. I found out otherwise. Billy Graham supposedly said, I believe God has shown me that unless we have a change in America, we have 1,000 days as a free nation, this traditional apocalyptic rhetoric. Bill Bright of the Christian Anti-Communist Crusade, another unsung hero in this movement, said, I do not believe we'll survive more than 3 years for a free nation. Pat Robertson chimes in with an amen. Pat Robertson said, I remembered it so well. Charles Stanley slapped his hand on the table and said, I'll give my life to solve this. I'll give everything. We've got to turn this country. Robertson said, me too. I'll die to turn this country, whatever it takes. We cannot lose this country. And they all kind of join in this kind of, really is kind of a political altar call, right? I mean, they're devoting their lives not merely to Christ. They did that a long time ago, but to electing Republicans to advance the cause of Christ.
This is the new right clearly courting evangelical leaders. Weyrich called the meeting. These religious leaders responded by bringing their fears that this is the worst that North America has ever been. Something, by the way, that Christian leaders have been saying since before the U.S. was even a country. Not only did they have emotion on their side, but also data. Weyrich paid $30,000 for a survey of congregants. Would they continue to support their pastors spiritually and financially if they got involved in politics? The answer was unequivocally yes.
Next thing you know, churches are being organized like union halls were organized, basically, to advance the cause of a political party. Christians have their union movement, and it's the Christian right.
When we return, I'll walk you through two important moments when we saw Christians identify with Reagan before the election. One where they tried to help him pick his VP, and another where they rallied for his win. While you listen to the ads, why not take a moment to write a review of Truce on your favorite podcasting app? It really helps people find the show.
This paid message is from Instant Church Directory, the smart, practical solution for building a professional church directory without the usual headaches. If you've ever thought, there has to be an easier way, you're not alone. Creating and maintaining a church directory shouldn't be complicated or time-consuming. With Instant Church Directory, you can build a fully customized photo directory in under an hour and keep it updated all year long. Whether you're refreshing an outdated directory or starting from scratch, the process is fast, intuitive, and secure. Your members get instant access through the web or free mobile apps, and you can also download a PDF for printing or digital sharing. It's designed to help your ministry stay connected without adding more work to your plate. Now is a great time to begin. Try Instant Church Directory free for 30 days and see how simple, even enjoyable, creating a church directory can be. Visit instantchurchdirectory.com to get started today.
This paid message is from Glue, a technology platform for the faith ecosystem. Did you know that when you attend your local church, volunteer your time to a local ministry, or give to a nonprofit, you're participating in a vast faith ecosystem of more than 450,000 organizations. Imagine what it would be like if those churches and ministries were better connected to one another. How much good could be accomplished? This is a principle at Glue, to release collective strength so you can achieve more together than alone. By helping churches connect with ministry partners, creating systems for leaders to engage with their congregations and volunteers, and building values-aligned technology solutions, Glue is shaping tech as a force for good. Learn more about how Glue is building high tech for a higher purpose at glue.com.
Welcome back. We're going to hone in on two moments where evangelicals with big followings jumped behind Ronald Reagan. Okay, so Republican forces had already courted the religious vote. We saw this with the meeting in Dallas that Rick covered a few minutes ago, and even much earlier with Nixon's appearances at Billy Graham events. But just how tightly knit were these unlikely allies? The Republican National Convention of 1980 was on a day full of thunderstorms, complete with 80-mile-an-hour winds. Howard Phillips's plane tried to land in the storm, causing him to run an hour late. This founding member of the New Right knew a lot of people. He pulled strings, and soon a police escort swept him to a meeting with Reagan in his suite. Also there were familiar names: Paul Weyrich, Phyllis Schlafly, and Jerry Falwell. For Schlafly, this might have felt like full recognition of her efforts bringing together the religious right. Here she was, in the room with the favorite for the Republican nomination. But it was close to the end of the line for her. She didn't know it yet, but she would be dropped by Reagan as soon as they no longer needed her extremism, or her mailing list. As for Falwell, he'd already told Reagan that he would, quote, vote for him even if he had the devil on his ticket, end quote, though he preferred Jack Kemp or Jesse Helms. All of this from a fundamentalist who had only recently been a separatist. But thankfully, the Reagan team wasn't considering the devil as a running mate. It wanted George H.W. Bush. Bush had been, among other things, head of the RNC and the CIA. He was, compared to Reagan, a moderate, which meant he could calm worries about Reagan's extremism. Schlafly and Falwell told Reagan not to choose Bush as his VP. Phyllis specifically said it would hurt his ticket. The debate over who to choose was drawn out and bounced around a lot of names, including former President Gerald Ford. It's interesting that Falwell and Schlafly were present for such a crucial moment during the convention. Two people who desperately wanted to feel heard. But it's also significant that Reagan's team didn't listen to them. As we'll see, the religious voters didn't need a leader to actually take their advice. They just wanted to feel like they had a place at the table. Here, during this storm, they had it. They were listened to. And then the campaign ignored their advice. George Bush would be the vice president. The second example of evangelicals with large followings fawning over Reagan came just a month later in Dallas. Religious Roundtable hosted their national affairs briefing in August of 1980. 16,000 people were in attendance. The first person to address the crowds urged people there to vote for Ronald Reagan. Then came a long list of usual suspects: Tim LaHaye, SBC President Adrian Rogers, Richard DeVos, founder of the Amway multi-level marketing pyramid-shaped scheme that preys on religious people and the poor. New Right founder Paul Weyrich got up on stage to describe how he didn't want the general population to vote. He wanted their kinds of people to be the ones who voted. He said,
"As a matter of fact, our leverage in elections goes up as the voting populace goes down."
Take a moment to dwell on the fact that Weyrich spoke at this event, was crucial to this event. If you haven't seen the connection between the New Right and the bonding of evangelicals to the Republican Party, here it is. He and his friends bragged about organizing discontent, using emotional issues to get people to support their vision of limited government and economics. And he's in the room, on the platform, in plain sight, telling Christians to suppress voter turnout. He literally said there are no complex issues.
Ultimately, everything can be reduced to right and wrong. Everything. We see everything in black and white perspectives because Scripture sees things in black and white perspective.
Then spoke James Robeson, the Dallas televangelist, the guy from earlier this episode who preached from the National Enquirer to say that homosexuals were trafficking young boys. This is an actor portraying his speech.
There is no possible way that you can separate God from government and have a successful government. God is the ultimate authority.
He goes on to preach about the, quote, vast amount of medical knowledge and wisdom, end quote, in the Bible. Then pivots to the economy. This audio is really Robeson.
Suppose at tax time next year we find ourselves a little short. Why not just take a roll of toilet paper, unroll it, and print up some more money if you're short? That's what they do when they need money. And the money they're printing is as worthless as toilet tissue.
Some strong subtext, right? I mean, what do you hear? Perhaps a call to the return of the gold standard, or Milton Friedman's monetarism? A dash of supply-side economics? Listen in this next clip to how he characterizes the U.S. government. As candidate Reagan claps in the background, he advocates a bunch of things that are decidedly not mentioned in the Bible. Like, the Bible is neither for or against them. It literally says nothing about them. Small government, that a country is for protection, but not creating things.
And we've been deceived into believing that the government can spend our way out of debt and pay off the poor. Where are they going to get all that money they're promising now recently, the billions and billions of dollars? Where are they going to get all that money? Who's going to produce it? Don't you know the government doesn't produce anything and was never intended to? It's a protector. It's not a provider, and it's certainly not a producer. It's a confiscator and a consumer and a disperser of your wealth. It produces nothing. And it will function best when it functions least. It is a regulator. It is not a provider. And certainly not a producer.
He also preached that since our money and the Pledge of Allegiance say one nation under God, that's proof enough of this being a Christian country. Something he neglected to mention was only 30 years old at that point. At the end of his speech, he thanked Ronald Reagan for attending and for being concerned about what concerns Christians. At the same rally, D. James Kennedy preached that if we didn't get our act together, quote, 1980 would be America's last free election. End quote. Then came Wally Criswell, again, the guy who opposed integration of schools. He was right there on the dais, and his job? Introducing Ronald Reagan.
Ronald Reagan makes his famous pronouncement, "I know you can't endorse me, but I endorse you."
That moment is huge. So many of the books I read this season point to Reagan's obvious endorsement of the Christian right. It's rare to see something so blatant from a candidate. Meanwhile, Jimmy Carter was nowhere to be seen. This whole event, and you can watch clips of it online, is a complete endorsement of everything we've covered this season. Small government, fear that America is about to be overtaken by communists or wickedness, Christians seeing it as their duty to overtake the government with the help of other religious folks, a la Francis Schaeffer. Taking over the country not from the ground up, as R.J. Rushdoony advocated, but from the top down. And speaking of R.J. Rushdoony...
Meanwhile, backstage, I found something, absolutely astonishing. That, Gary North, who's the son-in-law of R.J. Rushdoony, the theocrat who, thinks that biblical laws about homosexuality should be enforced on penalty of stoning, complains that Dr. Rushdoony has not been invited to be a part of the program. And Reagan's outreach to the new Christian right, Ed Billings, who's one of the founders of the Moral Majority, responds diplomatically, "If it weren't for Rushdoony's books, none of us would be here." And then North complains, "Nobody in the audience understands that." And Billings says, "True, but we do." This assurance that these are the values that Ronald Reagan is going to take into the White House. He might not be able to say it publicly, but privately, he's basically saying that, he is the candidate of the people who are terrified that secular humanists are going to be forcing them to have their children educated by homosexuals.
Religious leaders had their man, the one who said the Shibboleths to prove, at least well enough, that he was their guy. I don't want to give you the impression that Christians had never supported the Republican Party before this time, because that's not true. But it's in the election of 1980 where they wholeheartedly embrace Ronald Reagan that the bond between republicanism and evangelicalism solidified, to the point where it seems like today the shibboleth isn't "Are you born again?" or "What will you say when you reach the pearly gates?" but "Are you a Republican?" or "Did you vote for Donald Trump?" Reagan, for his part, kept the assurances coming. Here are excerpts from the 1980 Republican platform. See if you can pick out things we've talked about this season.
Overseas conditions, already perilous, deteriorate. The Soviet Union, for the first time, is acquiring the means to obliterate or cripple our land-based missile system and blackmail us into submission. Marxist tyrannies spread more rapidly through the Third World and Latin America.
Okay, so fear of communism and Marxism. What do you hear in this next clip?
History could record, if we let the drift go on, that the American experiment, so marvelously successful for 200 years, came strangely, needlessly, tragically to a dismal end early in our 3rd century.
Okay, so what does that sound like? Maybe a little bit of Darbyism? An apocalyptic vision for sure, accompanied with the typical escape hatch that allows these predictions to avoid fact-checking later on. If we don't act, the country will fall apart. But if it doesn't fall apart, it must mean we stopped it. You can't say we were false prophets when the world didn't end. We had an escape clause, a nice little insurance policy. In this next quote, identify the push for individualism.
Republicans disagree and have always taken the side of the individual, whose freedoms are threatened by the big government that democratic idea has spawned. Our case for the individual is stronger than ever. A defense of the individual against government was never more needed, and we will continue to mount it.
How about a tip of the cap to religion?
And so, in this 1980 Republican platform, we call out to the American people, with God's help, let us now, together, make America great again. Let us now, together, make a new beginning.
There's the familiar slogan. That's right, Make America Great Again was used by Reagan before it was used by Donald Trump. Accompanied, of course, by no indication of what bygone era they're referring to. How about some light Christian nationalism?
Steeped in the Judeo-Christian ethic and in Anglo-Saxon theories of law and right, our legal and political institutions have evolved over many generations to form a stable system that serves free men and women well.
Vote for us. We'll protect you, make you rich, save you from Marxism, and allude to your religion in our platform. This next clip sounds really progressive at first. It's from Ronald Reagan's nomination speech, where he's making a promise to help women after the 1970s were such a contentious era. But listen closely. It's really just a brush off of the ERA, which would have created a blanket national law preventing discrimination against women. Instead, he offers to make it a state's issue, not a national one.
I will establish a liaison with the 50 governors to encourage them to eliminate wherever it exists discrimination against women. I will monitor federal laws to ensure their implementation and to add statutes if they are needed.
Music to the ears of those against the ERA, right? No need to make a federal law. The states will make the laws. When we ask, why did some evangelicals, not all of them, turn to the Republican Party in the 1980s, it's easy to latch onto one of the many things that we've covered this season. But remember that it was for a lot of different reasons. Listen, Jimmy Carter played to evangelicals too. He sprinkled in references to God like everyone else. It's not enough to say that evangelicals go for the person who speaks Christianese. It's questionable to say that Reagan even was a Christian, especially by the separatist fundamentalist standards of the people who were questioning him. These guys didn't just want to hear some religious shibboleths. They also wanted to hear political and social shibboleths as well, many of which are not in the Bible one way or the other. Low taxes, protectionism, nuclear armament, anti-ERA statements. It seems like sometimes the Christianese was just a candy shell for the political shibboleths. Reagan's team knew how to speak the right words, to signal that we get your fears about the end of the world, the decline in morals that preachers have been talking about since literally before the founding of the nation. We hear you. We get you. Shibboleth, shibboleth, shibboleth. That's vital to understand. Because yes, these guys were looking for nominees to say they were Christians, but they landed on a guy who had dubious credentials at best. If you need another example that these shibboleths were just a formality, remember something we talked about earlier. When John Conley was asked what he'd say at the pearly gates, he replied,
My mother was a Methodist, my pappy was a Methodist, my grandmother was a Methodist, and I just tell him I ain't any worse than any of the other people who went into heaven.
Not a great answer. Now, did evangelical leaders shun him? Not really. Bill Bright just went to work coaching him. When Reagan didn't know what it meant to be born again, did they run the other way? Hardly. Instead, they taught him the correct words to say. Is that a sign that the questions were a real test of faith, or that they simply wanted to make sure that the candidates knew their lines? So to say that these tests of a candidate's salvation were the deciding factor is disingenuous. They weren't really like the people of Gilead trying to suss out the Ephraimites. At best, they wanted to hear a religious cover for the economic and social issues that really took precedent in their minds, so that they could have a seat at the table. Those shibboleths were every bit as important as the seemingly pious words about Jesus. At worst, they were ignorant about how unqualified Reagan was as a symbol of Christianity. He was, really, an actor who knew his lines. I'll leave you here with Ronald Reagan at the close of his speech, accepting the nomination of the Republican Party in 1980.
I have thought of something that's not a part of my speech and worried over whether I should do it. Can we doubt that only a divine providence placed this land, this island of freedom, here as a refuge for all those people in the world who yearn to breathe free? Jews and Christians enduring persecution behind the Iron Curtain, the boat people of Southeast Asia, of Cuba, and of Haiti, the victims of drought and famine in Africa, the freedom fighters in Afghanistan, and our own countrymen held in savage captivity. I'll confess that I've been a little afraid to suggest what I'm going to suggest. I'm more afraid not to. Can we begin our crusade, join together in a moment of silent prayer? God bless America. Thank you.
You can find a full list of sources for this episode on the website or in your show notes. They include Reaganland with my guest Rick Perlstein, as well as The Evangelicals by Francis Fitzgerald, the archives at the Reagan Library, C-SPAN, and A Prophet with Honor by William Martin. Follow the show on social media and let me know your thoughts about these clips. Listen, this season is long for a reason, to get us to sit with these ideas, to think about them. On most episodes of the show, I've included discussion questions in your show notes and on the website, and links to the speeches so you can discuss this stuff with your small group, friends, and family. Help me send a message that Christian media can be thought-provoking while still honoring the Bible. Visit trucepodcast.com/donate to learn how you can help via Patreon, check, PayPal, or Venmo, where you can find me at Truce Podcast. Thanks to everyone who gave me their voices for this episode, including Chris Sloan, Lauren Fry, and my friend Dave Monroe. Truce is a production of Truce Media, LLC. God willing, we'll talk again soon. I'm Chris Starin, and this is Truce.